You know, good evening. This is intimidating. You know, I speak a lot, but getting chills thinking about where I am right now and what else has happened here. I'll try to do my best to live up to just a little part of it. And then we talk about racism, and it sounds like a thing. It sounds like something somebody is. I grew up in the segregated South. One of the first things that I learned was C and W. Is my microphone on? I saw people kind of, are we good?
Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
Well, I'm on this mic. Does that help any? Okay. And this mic too? I'm on both of them. All right, I can do that. I had a false sense of security there. There we go. Now I can hear myself. I was saying that I was born in the segregated South in Tennessee and grew up. One of the first things I remember learning were the letters C and W. So I would know not to drink out of the wrong water fountain. Okay? And I don't think of myself as ancient, and yet that wasn't that long ago. And today we talk about the power of race, and it feels like nothing has changed. Here's the paradox. It is so powerful because it's changing all the time. Racism is like a virus that's constantly adapting itself to new hosts. And we can see it adapting itself to the host in which we live in the early 21st century with all the social media and so forth. But it's been changing ever since 1619. It has never been a static thing. Even during slavery, the shape of what white people thought about black people and the rationales they came up with to explain why they were willing to inflict such injustice for generation after generation has constantly changed. Now tonight we want to talk about the most immediate beginnings of what we think of as segregation, because it was not clear after the end of slavery, which came with startling speed after 250 years of slavery. 250 years of slavery in Virginia. Slavery existed for 100 years longer than we are from the Civil War and emancipation right now. Okay? So that ends in 4 years. What is going to replace it? And nobody knows. Now some things become clear pretty early on. Churches were among the first institutions to separate because black congregants went to white congregants and say, how many times I can hit that, we want to be our own church. And sometimes white people would help, sometimes they would be angry, but it didn't really matter. African American people went on their own churches anyway. Very early on, cemeteries are segregated after emancipation. Very early on, things like hotels and restaurants are segregated. But here's the thing, the word segregation is not even used until the early 20th century. Okay? So it's not that people go, okay, slavery's gone, now it's segregation. There were several decades when people were trying to figure out what the heck is going to replace all the controls and pressure of slavery. And it was not clear for several decades. As it turns out, Danville plays an important role in Virginia's path toward figuring out what segregation is going to look like. So what you found is that in the countryside as well as in the city, black people and white people associated with members of their own race after emancipation, except in those situations where it cannot be avoided. Work, commerce, politics, and travel. Those are the places that couldn't be finessed. People had to figure out, what are we going to do with that? So here's the thing. The idea of a completely orchestrated society in which everything is labeled, down to the school books that are being stored in warehouses over the summer, it took a long time for the South to get there. I want to talk about how that happened. Now here's the most important thing to understand. Segregation is not just the legacy of slavery, though it of course is that. Segregation had to be invented. And where does it come from? It comes from the deep social change that the South underwent after the Civil War. And Danville sees this as much as anybody. So we're not going to talk about all the Civil War stuff. unless you want to in the question and answer period. But after the Civil War, Danville's population doubles. And Danville, which has only had a railroad for a few years before the Civil War, is a railroad town. And it begins to burgeon. And this is the pattern all across the South. African American people go to towns and cities because there they have at least some chance. What do they have a chance for? Maybe a chance for a job that would pay a living wage. Maybe a chance for their children to go to a decent school. Maybe a chance to have a large congregation of their own. And white Virginians, white Southerners don't like this. The countryside sort of empties out in some ways as black people come into towns and cities. And Danville is one of the examples of that. So when all these people who don't know each other and are the strangers coming together, white Southerners are not sure what's going to hold all of this in place. And they begin putting various kinds of laws in place. And here's the irony. The newer a place, the more thoroughly segregated it was. So you would find the newest towns in Virginia. Norfolk grows very rapidly. Big Lick becomes Roanoke. Those places, you're building new things, you segregated at the beginning. But if you're in older places, it's not clear how you're going to change custom. So the newer a place is, the more segregated it was. This is the fundamental thing to understand. Segregation is a product of social change and what people at the time called progress. It wasn't just backwardness, even though it became that fairly quickly. Now here's the main problem. There are no statewide segregation laws for 30 years after the Civil War. It's all negotiated town by town, location by location. But in the 1880s, and again, this is a place where Danville matters, they have to create new statewide segregation laws because there are new things that are causing problems, and those new things are the railroads. Now, at home, you can kind of know that the black people can come shopping on Saturday afternoon downtown. That's kind of established. But you get on a railroad car and you leave Danville and you head, say, to Charlotte. With each stop, you cannot know what the racial deal is. So here's the problem. Black people had the effrontery to actually succeed in the New South. They actually managed, with the small resources that they had, to educate their children. Black literacy skyrockets in the decades after the Civil War. Churches proliferate. Schools are started. Black businesses. You go to Richmond, there's a whole business district that emerges in just 20 years after the Civil War. And in all these ways, white people are going, what's this? This can't be right, because we told ourselves for 250 years that black people weren't capable of learning, and here they are starting their own schools. We told ourselves for 250 years that we had to teach them Christianity, and here they are, in many instances, looking like better Christians than we are. And we told ourselves that they didn't really know how to be respectable, but look at them. Look at the way they're carrying themselves. And here's where push comes to shove. Railroads back then have two classes of cars, first and second. Kind of non-intuitively, the second class car is in front because it's the one closer to the locomotive. And if you're in the second class car, all that smoke and cinders are blowing in. Now, chances are you don't care too much, because if you're in the second class car, you're probably spitting tobacco juice all over the floor. And you're just likely to be taking a big swig of whiskey out of your flask. And no telling what, and you're likely to be just using any word that comes to mind. And the second class car is not a place that you want to be. The other car is called sometimes the first class car, but it's also called the ladies' car, because the ladies' car has upholstery, and it has, people don't spit on the floor as much probably, and it has some of the feeling of a parlor. Well, black people getting ready to go off to a convention for their church or something, we're willing to pay that extra money to ride in the first class car, especially if it's young men and women. Black families are saving up so that their daughter or their wife can be in that respectable car so they don't have to hear this unchristian language. They don't have to be around all that drinking. And sometimes they go onto the first class car, the ladies' car, and people know that they're the good people. They know they're the ones who lead the church. They know that they're the ones that are hardworking. That seems okay. But it comes to the second stop, and somebody gets on to put his wife on the railroad car and sees African American people, and over and over again, he goes up to the conductor and says, "We can't have this." I know, it really makes you upset to think about it. And worse than that, time after time, they would telegraph ahead to the next stop that there are people on this car who shouldn't be. Meet us at the station and help make sure that they are thrown off. And so there was violence time after time of black people being assaulted at some stop. And the conductors are trying to figure out what are they supposed to do about all this. There's not these laws. So here's the strange thing, is that segregation is being generated in the first class cars. And the state legislators think, oh, what are we going to do about this? We need the railroads. We don't really like them because they're the big business at the time and they're pushing everybody around. The railroads don't really want to carry passenger traffic because they can't make any money out of it. And they certainly don't want to be running extra cars for black people. And so here's the strange thing, is that the railroads don't want to do this. They don't want to be policing these fluid race relations. And it's not clear always to people who is white and who is black. You know, they're looking at this and thinking, I kind of looking and I don't know if you should be in this car or not, but boy, if I say the wrong thing, there's no telling what's going to happen. And this thing too, African American people sue the railroads over and over again. They say, I paid for a first class ticket. I deserve a first class car. And the courts say, you know, you're right. You do. And so time after time, the railroads are going, come on. We're being sued to police this kind of fluid race relations. What are we going to do? So the strange thing is state legislators say, here's what we need to do. And this is happening around the country, that across the whole South. The idea is we're going to have to, the law says that if these conditions are equal, it would be okay if we made them separate. And this is not until 1896 then that separate but equal comes around. So think about it. This is 30 years that it took to get there. And during that 30 years, it grows out of black people saying, I'm an American, these are my rights. There's the 14th Amendment. I paid for the ticket. We're as respectable as you are. We're causing no problems. We deserve to have a place in this train. These are the first statewide segregation laws all across the South, and they're all adopted in the very late 1880s and in the 1890s. And so what we think of as segregation grows out of that. And it's not an accident until they have those laws that you start people talking about segregation. Well, once you have the railroads kind of under control, and the railroads are kind of like a piece of town, of a city, moving across the countryside. Out in the country, they've got things, you know, the white people have got things arranged they want, but then you've got these well-dressed black people rolling into town through the first-class car, and it just seems to disturb everything. Now, the railroads say, look, we don't want to spend much money on these first-class cars for black people, so what do you say we do this? We take the second-class car with all the spitting and cursing and drinking and just kind of put up a little partition. And we'll call that first-class treatment for colored people. And so that's kind of what, and black people sue over and over again on that as well. But that becomes the deal that the white South tolerates, is that we'll have the charade of separate but equal, but not really separate but equal. Now, once the railroad segregation is in place, people look at this and go, you know, this is a really good idea in general. let's segregate these brand new streetcars in Richmond, which has the first streetcar system in the world. And as soon as it's invented, they start segregating it. And every time something new comes along, it's being segregated. And it's seen as a model of what modern race relations should look like. Everything is labeled, everything is prescribed, there's no uncertainty, there's no ambiguity about what we should be doing. People from South Africa come over and are impressed by this and adopt the concept of segregation, and it becomes the roots of apartheid. It's the extension of the same idea that the South, over several generations, evolved. Now, Danville plays an important role in all of this, because one of the things that's churning up race relations as white people see it is politics. Now, it's hard for us to imagine, but there was a time when politics was controversial in America. And here's the situation. Weirdly, Virginia never actually has Reconstruction. Now, that's another lecture that I'll give you some other time, but they don't. And so it ends in 1870, and the strange thing about it is that black people, even though it's only men who are able to vote, women work with them aggressively to help create a new political culture. Black people want to vote, and they want to hold office, and they want to use the government to do things, and they refuse to quit when white people tell them to. After Reconstruction ends in 1870, the white Virginia leaders do what they can to gerrymander, to make sure that only certain parts of the state have much black political representation, but black political representation continues after Reconstruction's over. And Virginia sees a lot of it. There are black office holders. I mean, the 24 black men helped write the Constitution of Virginia in 1867 in Richmond, and then they hold political office, especially in the East, but also in the South Side. Wherever there's enough of a black majority to be able to sustain an office holder, they do. So Danville becomes the real point of conflict in all this, because in the early 1880s, Virginia looks like it follows a path no other southern state does. So here's the situation. You've got these black men who are still voting and holding office. It's not clear if the Republicans are going to support them anymore or not. But they don't care. They are maintaining their own political power. But there's a big controversy, which is, should Virginia pay off the debt that it had before the Civil War and that it ran up during the Civil War? Did the rich white men who bought the bonds before the Civil War deserve to be repaid, or was all that gone with the wind? Okay? Was that gone? Well, not surprisingly, the people who owned the bonds said, yeah, you will pay them, and we don't care very much if all the state's resources need to go to repay those. Because the only thing that had happened during Virginia's brief Reconstruction, and this bold idea, Virginia created its first system of public education. There's no public education in Virginia until the brief moment that there is Reconstruction. Well, after Reconstruction's over, this other group, strangely led by a former Confederate general, William Mahone, who's also a railroad owner, but he says, no, what we need to do is readjust the debt, bring it down. We don't need to repay every dollar of these bondholders, because we need to pay for these schools. We need to put some money into the prisons. We need to make sure that we're actually progressing. Instead of putting all our money into something we racked up back during the days of slavery and secession, let's build a new Virginia. And African Americans said, yes, that is what we need to do. Let's invest in these new institutions. Because now there are new institutions that are mental institutions for African Americans, or hospitals, and all these kinds of things require investment, especially the schools. Well, there's a huge battle about all this. And the Democrats are furious that anybody has the effrontery to challenge their honor. That they are going to, if Virginia is going to be able to hold its head high in the nation and with investors from England and the North, we're going to have to show that we're honorable men paying off our debts. But as one readjuster said, honor won't buy breakfast. And they have to figure out what they're going to do. So here's the thing. You've got all this volatile uncertainty of black men who are mobilized to come into churches like this to talk about what it means to be an American, to take upon the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and to say this is our legacy as well, and we know how to mobilize. You've got those around. Now you've got some of these readjusters, and the Democrats say, we can't have this. But here in Danville, the readjusters write a new plan that allows 2 of the 3 districts in Danville to be controlled by a coalition of the readjusters, black people and white. And Danville comes under the control of the readjusters in which black people have a major role. The white Danvillians, is that the word? Yeah, Danvillites, I don't know what. Put out a pamphlet to white voters across Virginia, especially in the Southwest and the Shenandoah Valley, saying, we are living through terrible humiliation. We are living through a situation in which black people are walking the streets like they live here too. I don't want to shock all of you, but there's this. This new city government actually allowed black people to have a majority of the stalls in the city market because they applied for them first. And white people are like, can you believe the injustices that we are having to endure because of this government? We need people all across the Commonwealth to vote against the readjusters, vote for the conservatives, as they're called, and get rid of all this. Well, so Danville's kind of on edge. That comes out in October of 1882. Now, ironically, that's exactly the year that the men invest in the mill that becomes the origins of Dan River Mills. And that is in 1882, the very same year. So you can see how this is growing out of change. It's not growing out of stagnation, right? So they're saying we can't afford to have our burgeoning new city, which is going to capture the power of the Dan River, which is going to not only be a leader in tobacco, but we are going to be able to use this new working population of white women and children to come into the textile mills, and we will be the leaders in the nation. But if we're going to do that, we've got to have this volatile racial order under control. So you need to remember, this is 1882, so they don't have all the segregation laws in place yet, right? Virginia's not done all that. So what they figure out is we're going to have to find a way to overthrow this group. Well, people are on pins and needles here in Danville. That there is a highly volatile situation. And one day, and nobody, you will never know exactly what happened, but there's a young black man and a young white man bump into each other on the sidewalk. And that grows into the Danville Riot of 1883. And what fuels it is these unsettled race relations in which black people have aspiration and accomplishment, in which they demand to be treated with respect. And it grows over things that seem maybe marginal in retrospect. They said the black women in the market refer to white women, I want you all to be prepared for this, as women, not ladies. We actually heard some of the black people selling pies or chickens down the market refer to white women as women. And you know what? I heard them also refer to fellow black people as ladies. Clearly, we cannot have this. Now, This is true. This is what people were saying at the time. And I'm telling you, we can see how silly that is, but it reminds you, what is this all about? They are trying to establish the rules by which people recognize how much humanity the other person is allowed to have. They are trying to figure out, do we insist on sharing the sidewalk 50-50, or do black people need to step aside whenever a white person comes by? Should white people have preference? Because there's also, if you can believe this, black policemen. And white people can't believe that that's happening as well. So you can see these things are highly symbolic as well as about people's livelihoods. And so Danville has a riot in which 4 black men are killed. There's 2 or 3 minutes of gunfire in which these men are killed. But it becomes a rallying cry for white people across the state of Virginia. This must come to an end. We cannot have another Danville. We cannot have a situation in which black people and white people are in political alliance for their mutual benefit. We cannot have them challenging the control of good conservative white people. Because once this starts, there's no telling where it might be. If it begins on the sidewalks and goes all the way to the election box, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, this very church, not this building, but this church is founded in 1865. And white people can look around and see there seems to be no limit to the ambitions of our black neighbors. They seem to want to have everyone educate their children as much as we do. Now, I don't particularly want to be taxed to educate my children, but now I certainly don't want to be taxed to educate colored children. And so you can see what a cauldron all of this is in which this is emerging. I don't want to ruin the story for you, but the Readjusters lose. And the Democrats in Virginia, as they do all across the South, come back into control in the late 1880s. And this is a paraphrase of a quote. I have all this lecture and I haven't looked at a word of it. I'm just into it. This is a paraphrase about 1890. A white Mississippian says, those of us who are older, who knew slavery, who knew the Civil War, are about to pass from the stage. And here's a weird thing to think about. 1889, 3/4 of Jefferson, when Jefferson Davis dies, 3/4 of his cabinet's already died. Okay? So all this is a new generation of black and white who are figuring out what's a post-slavery world supposed to look like. And a lot of the men who are making these laws are in their 30s. And they're trying to say, what we want is a progressive South in which everything is written down by law and we don't have all this violence. This shows what happens if you don't have clear directions for what everybody's supposed to do all the time. So this guy from Mississippi says, we cannot leave the stage with our sons having a lie in their mouth and a shotgun in their hands. Because here's the situation. Because black people insist on having political power and using it for their own interest, white people have to intimidate them, or have to bribe them, or have to give them what they want. And white people say, this is such an injustice to us that we're going to have to get rid of that. We cannot have black voting. So you might find, even if only 15% of the African American men in a particular county would vote, but you have 2 white men who want to be the conservative candidate, but you have this element there that each side might appeal to because they can still vote, it introduces an element of instability into Southern politics. We cannot leave our sons with lies in their mouths and shotguns in their hands. So here's what we're going to do. Now, one possibility would be to create a more equitable political system. But instead, they said, what we need to do is to make sure that black people don't vote anymore. So we are going to write new constitutions. Every southern state does this. Every southern state writes a new constitution starting in 1890 and ending in 1908, in which, here's what they say, there's this very inconvenient thing of the 15th Amendment that says you cannot deprive somebody of the right to vote because of race. So we're going to have to come up with some other plans. Here's an idea. you can't vote unless you can explain to the local registrar anything he might ask you about the United States Constitution. Now, we're not going to have it necessarily be just literacy, because there's a lot of illiterate white men, and we want those illiterate white men to still be able to vote. What we need to be able to do is find this increasing number of literate black people to not be able to vote. Because when you come in, and you may have seen Oprah Winfrey in this scene in Selma, when she comes in and she approaches the registrar can ask any question, and it has to be to his satisfaction whether you've answered the question correctly or not. Here's another rule. Okay, if we make it literacy, and there's all these white men who can't vote, or if we make it a poll tax, and there's some of these white men can't pay it, how about this? If your grandfather can vote, you can. You all have heard the grandfather clause. This is where it comes from. Okay? And it's just patently fraudulent, because all it is saying, if your grandfather back in the days before slavery could vote, you can. Virginia comes to this in 1901, 1902, and they have a convention in Richmond, and people come together. And they don't make any bones about it, what this is all about. This is to bring stability to Southern politics by making sure that black people don't vote. And they can't do it by just saying black people can't vote, so they have to do things like the poll tax. And if you don't pay the poll tax one year, it becomes cumulative. So it's going to cost you, 2 or 3 weeks' wages just to have the right to vote. If you miss it 1 year, then it's going to be 3 months' wages. And we're also going to pass laws that say if you're convicted of certain crimes that are especially petty larceny, that are considered Negro crimes, that's going to disfranchise you. And they pass all these series of laws, and including things like the secret ballot, because when you don't have the secret ballot, the Republicans, you need to remember that's the party that is still kind of supporting African American voting, they can hand out a ballot with the color on it, and people can say, I'm voting all Republican Party, and there you are. But why say we make it a secret ballot? And you have to go in there, and you have to be able, and we'll move things around so it's not, you can't have a symbol for which party is which, and we'll reduce voting that way. This happens across the United States. As a result, by the 1920s, Virginia has one of the lowest voter participation rates in the United States. Only about 20% of eligible voters bother to vote. Eligible voters. And this is when the bird machine comes along, right? So the idea is, well, what's the point of voting if it's already a rigged game? And so even men who could vote, white men who could vote, don't. But here's the thing to remember too. There are black congressmen from Virginia all the way to the turn of the 20th century. Until they are literally forced away from the polls, black political mobilization will not stop. And every time that this new wave of segregation comes in with the streetcars, black people protest. There are sit-ins. There are protests in the first decade of the 20th century. Driving down today, I passed a place where John Mitchell, the editor of the Richmond Planet, one of the most prominent African-American papers in the country, was talking about another terrible thing that was peaking in exactly these years of the 1880s and 1890s, which was lynching. And this was also tied to the same kind of violence that you saw in the Danville Riot, but the all-time peak of lynching is in the 1890s. And in Charlotte County, there was a lynching. And John Mitchell wrote about it. And they said, if you come down here, you'll pay with your life. And so John Mitchell straps on guns and takes the train down to Charlotte County and walks down the main street of the town. Okay? There is never a time when African-American Virginians accept this. They fight back with every tool at their disposal at every step. whether it's a lawsuit against the railroads or whether it's just refusing to not vote, even though your boss says, if I see you at the courthouse voting on Tuesday, don't even come back here because there's not a job for you. And the newspapers would print lists of black Republicans in a box with black border around it. Just outright intimidation. So, roots of segregation. Now, the roots obviously go back to those 250 years in slavery. But they begin to branch out and to grow deeper and to accelerate in what looks like it should be the new era after slavery. In the first generations, when it seems that there's so much possibility, so much hope, instead, those roots are choked, confined, cut off. But here's the thing. Despite every obstacle put in the way of African Americans, whether it's politically or economically, or in terms of this petty insult of segregation, or the profound insult of unequal funding for schools, or the profound insult of flagrantly unjust laws and enforcement and imprisonment. In spite of all those things, here's this mystery. How is it then that the great moral revolution in American history is led by the very people who have been the object of such injustice? How is it that the most profound change in American history comes from Southern black people who, despite all those obstacles, rise up and lead the nation out of the sin of segregation? It is because they are not defined by the things that are done to them. They are not defined by the limitations that white Virginians are forced upon them. They found strength in places such as this that sometimes below the vision of white people, they are building and sustaining these resources. So by the early 20th century, when your city is taking off and building one of the largest textile mills in the country, in the world, and is flourishing, it does so with all of this system of segregation in place, with a system of disfranchisement and the new Constitution in place, with it ever spreading. But it did not come without enormous conflict and struggle and uncertainty. And when it did come, it still did not stop black aspiration and determination to have all the rights that is their due as Americans. So it's hard to understand all of these things, and just because this has complicated origins doesn't mean that segregation was any less suffocating. But it does mean that it wasn't automatic. It doesn't mean there wasn't a time when it seemed to people that there might be a possibility for a different kind of South, a different kind of Virginia, a different kind of Danville. And for several generations, all those laws were in place. All that injustice was the law of the state. And yet, it was pushed aside by the moral power of people who refused to accept it. So that's the story of the roots of segregation. The part I want to do is actually talk with you all and see what questions and comments you have about all that, but I want to kind of give you the story. So who wants to go first? And you can't possibly. Or applause, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir. I think they want you to stand at this microphone. Is this correct? Yes.
I would like for you to talk about the role of the white church during slavery and after the Emancipation Proclamation, when black people were looked upon as chattel, meaning that they didn't have a soul, were looked upon as 2/5 of a man, and how the black folk were being lynched, yet the white preacher made them feel comfortable in that diabolical position.
Well, this is one of the most one of the hardest things for us to understand today. So there's lots of different parts to the story. When evangelical religion Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians first come to Virginia in the 18th century, at first it seems subversive of slavery because people can read the Bible and it says that all souls are equal in the eyes of God. And for a few decades, in the late 18th, early 19th century, evangelical slaveholders say, the Bible is clear about this. If we are to love one another as we love ourselves, how can I hold somebody in slavery? So there is a time when there is manumission. But then some of the preachers say, yeah, but you know what? The Bible doesn't say slavery is wrong. I believe it's our responsibility as slaveholders to be the best masters that we can. So about the 1820s and 1830s, that becomes the story, right? Is that the white evangelicals at one point believed that slavery was incompatible with Christianity, then they persuaded themselves that it was not. And from the pulpit, you would hear people, the common sermon would be, you have a responsibility, if you're white, to be a good master. You have a responsibility, if you're black, to be a good slave. And they would be in the balcony, and often they would go outside and have their own sermon in which there would be a different story told. But it is a fact that the white church became a bulwark of sustaining slavery because it gave white Southerners the thing they most wanted, which was a clear conscience. And so that was the way. Now, what happens with emancipation, as I mentioned before, many black people say, I want our own church. We already know people that we admire who are ready to be pastors. As it turns out, when I was president of the University of Richmond, my predecessor, 9 presidents earlier, had been the state-appointed pastor at First African Baptist Church in Richmond, the largest church in the state, because the law was that they had to have a white pastor. But he wrote a memoir, and he says, it was against the law for black people to preach, but there were some very long prayers and that he would tolerate, because he could recognize this. I had no moral authority. They respected the Christianity of each other, and I recognized that, so he kind of got out of the way. So people often said the most segregated moment, I think Dr. King said, right, the most segregated moment in American history, or in the United States, is on Sunday morning. So the churches become segregated, and steadily more so, until by the time that we're talking about here, there are basically black and white churches. It took a while for some black people who had been part of the church under slavery to leave, but over time the churches became almost entirely segregated. And here's the thing, sometimes people would have said that the black churches were a conservative force, that they, unlike the black politicians, were not talking about ending segregation. And yet, the church then became this powerful political force. The white church kind of was not a very active participant in the arrival of racial justice as a body. So that's a history of evangelical Christianity in the South in 2 minutes, but that's the general outline. Yes? Now, I'm not in charge, but what are we going to do about the microphones and stuff?
Just speak out.
Okay, be loud, okay?
I grew up here.
Why don't you stand up, though, if you don't mind?
I grew up here, and I was Catholic. And I didn't realize it until I came back in 1985. But the first Catholic church here was built in 1878, and it was never segregated. In fact, they built their church at the entrance to the Holwood Ross Historic District, which is the black professional neighborhood here. And I mean, growing up, I never knew that religion was segregated.
Well, see, you notice what I was talking about. Catholics were actually more progressive were more progressive in this front than the evangelical Protestants. Okay, and you would see there would often be schools that they would found and so forth. So that's the case. But all the churches of the South were not required to be segregated, but over time increasingly became so. But the Catholics were better about that. Yes, sir.
My name is my family history is very rich in Danville. I was born and raised here, moved up south, up north to New York, came back home. I just have a couple questions to make sure we're historically correct here, because they don't mention this yet. I know your talk was kind of short. I'm an avid, so maybe I need to be a bit.
I'll repeat the question, but yeah, go over there.
Good evening, everybody. Once again, my name is Abdul Hakim Abdullah. I was saying that my family history is rich here in Danville. My roots can be traced all the way back to President Thomas Jefferson. Prior to me changing my name and accepting Islam, I am a Woodson. Okay, so everybody, if you want to check that out on, go to your computers. I might even have some relatives, okay, that are Caucasian in this room. We have Fort Mitchell, Virginia, we have a family reunion every year, and those Woodsons show up, the Caucasians and the African Americans. We show up together, so we finally got over that hump. Okay, I wanted to talk to you about and ask you a question about the mixed families. The mixed families, either through marriage, okay, and you spoke about those African Americans that were higher Texas, they could pass for white, okay. Those that were able to do so, and they were told to do so when they were freed by their slave master. A lot of them told them, those of you that look like me, go live with the whites. If you can pass, go live with the whites, okay? Why is that aspect of our history, here in Danville and all across the South, why is that aspect written out of the history books?
Yeah, you have another question too, right? So I'll answer that one first, okay? Yeah, here's the interesting thing. From all that we can tell, that racial intermixing, we'll call it that, declined pretty radically after emancipation. And why? And the testimony from whites is very clear. Black men are protecting black women, okay? That under slavery, there was no protection, right? After emancipation, it is still dangerous as can possibly be. But one quote that I was reading over, he says, when a black woman goes into a store, there'll be 6 black men standing out in front waiting, because they're constantly being harassed. And these new environments I'm talking about in the cities and the railroads and all that, generally, the more associated something was with mixed gender, the more segregated it was. The reason that people freaked out so much about the parlor car is that it was like a parlor, right? And you think the other things that people most wanted to be segregated were things that mimicked the home, like a restaurant or whatever, okay? But you've noticed the irony of all this. White people would have black people cooking their food, raising their children in their own homes, right? Why? Because generally the spaces where black and white women were together were gender segregated. And what you would not want would be black women and white men, or more importantly, all of this is basically about keeping black men and white women apart in every way that they can. So it's very explicit in the historical record. That's what they're saying and what they're freaking out about all the time. So generally, most of the mixed marriages that people of mixed race are from before the Civil War or until relatively recently, because with segregation, one of the things it did was to prevent young children from coming to know each other in schools, because the schools are segregated, other places they might come to know. So from everything that I've seen, what you're talking about declines pretty radically after emancipation because of the efforts of African American people.
Okay, and I just wanted to add one point, because I have folks in my family who look like these people here. Okay, it was kept secret. And the reason I know all these facts, because Carter G. Woodson, a great historian, is my great uncle. And you look at his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, you look at the cover of the book, it's a picture on him. He don't look like me, he look like you. but he's my great uncle.
Sorry about that.
No, I'm just saying, no pun intended.
I know.
I mean, because these things have been written out of history, and I just want to say this for posterity, though. You see, there were people that were married to those higher case, the lighter skinned, fair skinned black people. Okay, they married, actually, white men actually married them, had children by them, you see, and they were able to walk the streets. Okay, and some of them, a lot were politicians, so they really didn't care.
Oh, that's true. But it's also the case if you were a very light-skinned African-American person.
I mean, they didn't do blood tests.
It'd be a good idea to get the heck out of Dodge. You know, it'd be better to go to the north and pass for white.
Yes.
So, yeah, we're
okay.
vociferously agreeing.
All right, thank you. And this is the second question, very short. As I was talking to some of the people I met downstairs, Muslims have a long history in this country. 30% of the slaves that came to this country were Muslims, practicing Muslims.
Yep.
Now, I don't understand this part. I understand the segregation part, but according to all I've done and the research I've done, they were actually practicing Muslims that either bought themselves free or were sleeved by their slave masters, and nobody ever bothered them. They ever purchased land with farmers and things like that. No one ever bothered them. Segregation didn't even apply to them. That's a historical fact. I don't understand why. Maybe you can help me out.
It wasn't for very long. What you're saying is true, but that was mainly in the 17th century. And Virginia, here's the thing Virginia has to do. There's no law that they inherit from England that tells you how you're supposed to enslave somebody, right? They actually have to import the words even, Negro, mulatto, from Spain, right? Because there's not a concept for this. So Virginia, it takes them decades, just like it takes decades to create segregation, it creates decades to figure out a law of slavery. Okay? And one of the things they try first is maybe if you're Christian, but it leaves out this group you're talking about. And so, and also they don't want people becoming Christian and then not being enslaved, right? That's going back to your question. That's the other thing you have to figure out. Masters do not want people to be able to convert themselves out of slavery, right? So what's left? What's left is if you were born of a person of African ancestry, you are enslaved. And so the Muslim influence, which you're exactly right, is suppressed and fades away, and this whole idea of race is invented. Nobody had this idea that all Africans were the same people before, but it was invented in Virginia in the 18th century.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good question.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. What else we got? Okay.
My question is, you mentioned Mahone and the Readjusters,
Yep.
and he was a Confederate general, as you said. And my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a brief period there with that movement where there was a biracial coalition, and there seems to be a natural common cause between poor whites and African Americans. What happened to split that coalition so soundly that the South never even developed a viable union movement or anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. It occurred to every generation that poor black people and poor white people had common interests. There was a line by a populist in the 1890s that follows the Readjusters, and he spoke to an integrated audience. He says, black people are in the ditch just like we are. And so that became the perpetual dream of every generation. Why can't people who have something in common get together against the people who have everything? And as you mentioned, Richmond in 1886 has the Knights of Labor visit, and it's a biracial movement. And the idea would be, and they also had women, if you can imagine that, involved. And so it's not that people couldn't imagine this same system of segregation and of disfranchisement that hollows out the political system leaves very little protection for those people who, say, in a union movement or any other way, want to get together. So a lot of the levers of advancement that you might wish had been taken away early on. So it's so strange to think about laws created to avoid black people riding on first-class cars then end up segregating everything else so much that it's hard to create solidarity across these racial lines. But they think of it in the 1880s, and they try it with Readjusters. They think of it in the 1890s with populism. They think of it in the 1920s and 30s, frankly, with communism coming in and saying they're the only ones who are willing to recognize that we have a solidarity across race. And then the great genius of the civil rights movement was to put it on native footing of evangelical Christianity and of the highest American ideals and say, this is who we are. The things that we value the most says that we are equal in the eyes of God, equal in the eyes of the law. We demand that be the case, right? So in many ways, every generation, there was never a time when black people accepted segregation as forever. There was never a time there was not always pushing back, and a lot of times it would be the white labor movement that would reach out, but that was smothered generally in the 30s and the 40s. Great question. Yes, sir. I don't know what the question is. Just give me time to think of an answer.
I'd like to say good evening. My name is Reverend William Avon King. I noticed that you talked about that it was a gap between 1865 and the Reconstruction where people were kind of integrated. And you talked about the roots of segregation. My question is kind of connected with religion also, but I want to be clear. Are you saying that this root, once it's planted, this is eternal? In other words, segregation.
To the contrary.
This segregation, even though they may pass laws to end it, is still a group of people, or there are still planners of the segregation, so that it will continue if integration takes place.
So this is where so segregation, as it was invented in this time, is gone, right? That's segregation. The roots go far deeper than just these particular sets of laws. And of course, that's what the civil rights movement was about, is to remove these laws, right? Does that remove racism or structural inequality or injustice? Not at all. But what it does remove is this first, most obvious and legal set of explicit discrimination. And so sometimes people want to act as if that was not a great victory because injustice has endured after it. It was a great victory. Getting that has led to the proliferation of a lot more African American office holding than we have because of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So, but the reason we're all here, I'm assuming, is that we all know that these roots run deep into other sources of injustice. So I'm not saying, in the same way that I'm showing that segregation was created, then segregation of that form was ended. But think about disfranchisement. The debates that we're having right now about gerrymandering and redistricting, they're about the same thing. Do we have a system in which everybody has a fair chance to cast a vote? It would seem not, judging from recent court decisions. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I just want to be really clear that I'm not saying that once that was gone, deep patterned roots of injustice didn't endure, but maybe I'm
1960.
Not answering the question, answering the question you asked.
Never ended the fight.
That's right.
For total integration, total justice. So what I'm saying now is that if you get a room, people tend to still today, even though the law's on the book, to segregate. You go in a place, you see the whites go to one side, the blacks go to another side. So what I'm saying, in that gap period between slavery and the Reconstruction, do you think the people who planted these roots had envisioned that if the root was cut, that they would replant it to continue? That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the people who created this expected it to endure. Yeah, and I would say in the 1950s, if you had told most white Southerners what was coming in the next 10 years, they wouldn't have believed it. Okay? In the same way that the ending of the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the modern world was impossible, so was the overturning of this deeply entrenched system of segregation. It was impossible until black people did it, right? So my kind of takeaway from all of this is is that far worse things can happen than we can imagine. But far better things can happen than we can imagine. That's when I'm talking to young people. They tend to believe that what is always going to be. But we've seen with our own eyes over and over again that it's not the case. Now, we've been trained to believe that far worse things can happen. Anybody who saw the Twin Towers go down know that just out of a clear blue sky these things can happen. But I also think about how in the world did this deeply entrenched system of segregation written to every law of the South, how could that be overturned? I believe that the injustices that we are enduring today can be overturned as well.
So in this last part of it,
okay.
So you're saying that the creators of this group were not of God, or were they of God, or how did they originate? Just like you use the term color. How did this originate in the beginning? Who were these people, and
they
where
were
did this
basically
start?
So very explicitly, the people who did it were the legislators of all the southern states. And they were all white men, and they were often young, a new generation who said, what we're going to have to do is put law in place to control this new generation of black people who never knew slavery either. The only thing that's going to hold them under control are these laws. And they thought that now we have established an order for this 20th century that's going to put us on a path toward progress. That's what they thought. They did it. Here's the strange thing for us. They bragged about that they were bringing peace and order so that you don't have more Danville riots. That's what they told themselves, okay? And that's one thing, is that people almost never do something they think is evil. They have a story about why it made sense. The story they told them is they were bringing peace for generations to the South with segregation and disfranchisement.
Thank you. Thank you.
One more question. Okay, we have one more person to ask one, so it's, well, there's three more, so I'll leave it up to you. I will talk till people can't stand it. I will try to give quick answers.
Hi, my name is Courtney Nicholas. My question is about the abolitionists. They fought so hard for so long to end slavery. It ends. I know that they were involved somewhat with the women's movement, and then that falls apart, and then segregation happens over time. Where were they when, as segregation is coming into place? Why did they stop fighting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some of them did fight it, but the thing is that the rest of the country let the South institute segregation. Now we need to remember, this is, of course, this is 70 years after the peak of abolitionism, right? And so a lot of them are dead. Mm-hmm. And this is the white North, and this Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court says, yes, you may let local rule, local custom determine the way you do these things. Basically, white Northerners and Westerners turned their back on the black South. Black people were pretty much on their own for generations. So that's, unfortunately, that's the truth. Yes, I don't know how we're going to, all three, no, we'll start from the front and work our way back. Go ahead, you're in the front.
Started,
yeah.
Whether, because I noticed that the end of this system, you all were talking about the lost cause.
Right.
And I wonder if you have ideas about reconceptualizing or telling the story of Reconstruction.
So the question was, could I talk a little bit about the future of Richmond's past, which I can. So there's 27 historic stakeholders in Richmond. We got together when the 150th anniversary of the Civil War was coming. We knew the state had invested a lot of money into commemorating that. And we said, you know, it's two events that are happening here. It's the anniversary of the Civil War, but it's the end of slavery, for which there is not a national holiday, for which there is not a national monument. The most important thing that's ever happened in this country is the end of slavery. And we don't acknowledge it, right? But what we said is, look, Richmond has been owned by the Civil War for 150 years. It's time for us to step up and own the Civil War and all that means, which means that we need to understand that Richmond was the center of the domestic slave trade as well. Okay? And rather than segregating our history, that we have white history and black history, why do you say we put it all together and recognize that we all inherit it all? People talk about their heritage. Well, you don't get to choose what you inherit, right? We've inherited that. If you live in Virginia now, this is your inheritance, this struggle with this. So all people came together and we had lots of conversations of small, and a lot of times they were hard. And I had a joke. I said I spoke in front of every kind of faith community, including the Country Club of Virginia. Because I found, and it goes back to the point, is that people of faith are willing to have conversations in a community that other people are not. It already builds a system of trust that I'm going to be honest with you and tell you what this really looks like to me. So and it's not an accident the Civil Rights Movement grew out of the church, right? And so I think that's what we're doing. So it's not stopped. I mean, the whole idea of the Future Richmond's Past is we're going to keep talking about it. And there's still a lot of work to be done. We still haven't built the museum or the monument to the center of the domestic slave trade down in Shockoe Bottom. That's got to be done. Here's something to think about. 1 million people are moved from the eastern South, Virginia and the Carolinas, to the western South. Far more African American people are bought and sold inside the United States than are brought here from Africa. Where can you go to see that? Nowhere. Where should it be? Richmond and Virginia, right? So we've got that work, and we have other work to do. But that's where it came. And basically, it just begins with humility. Look, let's just get together and recognize, look, this is all hard. None of us could carry it by ourselves. And so we had everybody from the United Daughters of the Confederacy to people who are, the Elegba Folklore Society, right? And keeping the African heritage alive. You have to do that. You have to put everybody at the table. Everybody has to be honest with everybody. We have to look at these hard things that we tried to avoid for a long time, but it can be done, and you all are doing it. There's 2 more questions, even though that sounded like a rousing conclusion. Yeah, so we're working on, yes, you are next.
Hi, thank you. As a young person that's returned back to Danville, this is a question that's really important for me, and I think you just said about talking about the hard things.
Yep.
And this is actually something that kept me away from home for a long time before I came back. So, in your opinion, how does the representation of the Confederacy contribute to a culture of systematic bias and inequity in Danville? And what advice do you give to community members that think it's not necessary to address this issue in order to make Danville a more inclusive, supportive, and equitable and desirable place to live, especially for young professionals?
Yeah. Well, you will have noticed that lots of places are struggling with this right now, right? And what's the Confederate legacy? And it's not as if Richmond's figured it out yet. We're working on it all the time as well. And you see the 2 poles, New Orleans taking down the statues and Charlottesville's in kind of agony about it all, what they're supposed to be doing. I would say to people who say it's heritage, not hate, that we can't just take out of the past what we want it to mean and say that anything that happened after that or what everybody else thinks doesn't matter. The fact is that there are many people who see Confederate flag and statue as symbols of the people who embodied segregation and fought against the Civil Rights Movement and still do. Whether people want to acknowledge that that is a fact, that people see that, we have to begin with that honesty and not just say, well, that's not what I mean by it. It doesn't matter. It is what it means to other people. So that's what everybody needs to think about it. We all share the history, just like we share the place. We share the air, right? We're all breathing this history all the time. And to act as if you only breathe the parts of it you want to is not a fair representation. So I guess I would, say I would always begin by assuming the best of intentions of somebody that I'm talking with about these things. Okay, tell me why you think it's okay, and then try to reason with them. I think, and to explain why I believe, and history shows, that this is a symbol of this kind of injustice. So We'll pretend that that was a good answer to your question, if that's okay. All right? And we have the final question in the back.
I struggle a lot with and not have the words to say to folks who say, when segregation was around, there were thriving white communities and thriving black communities.
Yeah.
And while that is a true statement, what would you as a historian say? What are the stories we tell ourselves today that keep us from becoming communities that are just thriving?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a great question. That's all the time we have for tonight. It is a fact that with every obstacle put in their path, African Americans in rural places and in towns and cities across the South created thriving churches and thriving schools and thriving businesses within segregation. Okay? That's a fact. It's also a fact that that was very convenient for white people, and that the thriving came despite fundamental structural injustices in taxation, in city services, in support for the schools, all those things. It did not become because segregation was a healthy system. I know you're not saying that, right? It did not become that. It came in spite of all the obstacles of the segregated South. So here's the thing. And our problems today are not because segregation ended, it's because those problems have endured. Right? So what you would need to do is to say, okay, if the fundamental problem is that there is, it created a disfranchisement, is generation after generation of unjust public policy, the logical thing would be to do to say, let's create a just public policy that is meant to address that legacy. But just acting as if, and I think this goes back to your question, as if the past is past and it doesn't come with a cost is dishonest. Okay? We need to recognize that all of these problems that we've inherited are only a product of the past. They are a projection of what we have inherited from the past. You can look at the ways our cities are structured. You can look at the ways that our classes are structured. A great part of it is a direct legacy, first of slavery and then of segregation. That's where we begin. And that's why I think, united in history is the right thing. Unless you have some idea of how the heck we got here, there is no way in the world you're going to make it better. It's like trying to tell a story, and here's the end, but you don't know anything that happened before. Right? But people say, well, got to put the past behind us, it's time to move on. Yeah, you can move on, but you have to know what you're moving on from. So I think that, literally speaking, if not to the choir, to the congregation here, or you wouldn't have come here to see this, but this is generally American preference, is to not to think about the hard parts of the past. And matter of fact, to turn the past into nostalgia. To imagine there was a time when we were greater than we are now. There was not. There was not. The best time of the United States is not in the past, because the times when things were great for some people, they were bought at the expense of other people. Okay? So it's not surprising that we dismantle these systems, that there are other kinds of adjustments that have to be made. But we need to make them with our eyes open and recognize that greatness lies in front of us, not behind us. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.